There are postings you choose, and postings that choose you, and Treaty Way Station Hadreth 7 chose me on the strength of a staffing gap, a routing error, and the fact that I was the only senior mess chief in the rotation who had prior experience cooking for non-human digestive systems. I want to be clear that prior experience at the time meant 18 months on a joint survey vessel, where I'd learned that Chelhari crew members required sulfur-supplemented protein at every meal, or they became irritable in ways that showed up in incident reports. That was the full extent of my qualifications. Hadreth 7's posting board apparently considered this sufficient. The station itself sat at the edge of what the navigation charts called Sector Hadreth. Nobody had a better name for it, and the sector designation had simply migrated onto the station over decades, until they were indistinguishable. At a transit junction that mattered, mostly because it was inconveniently placed relative to 3 different territorial agreements. Resupply vessels from 4 species used it as a waypoint. The Union maintained a skeleton crew of 11, myself 2 medics, an engineering team of 4, a logistics officer, a comms specialist, and 2 Union liaison officers who handled the diplomatic arithmetic of hosting guests who were not always delighted to find each other in the waiting area. It was not a glamorous assignment. The station smelled of recycled air, and whatever I had on the stove, and in the early months those were not always different things. The galley occupied a wedge-shaped space at the junction of 2 main corridors, which meant that anyone moving between the docking bays and the station's administrative core to pass within 15 meters of whatever I was cooking. I was told this was an accident of the original design. I suspected it was intentional. Hungry people are easier to manage than people who are merely inconvenienced, and the smell of something warm and real tends to sand the edges off a difficult day. I had been running galleys long enough to know that the smell was never an accident. The work suited me. I had known since my 3rd year of training that I was better at cooking than I was at most other things, and I had spent the subsequent 19 years finding out how right that assessment was. Remote postings were where the work got interesting. Limited stores, limited equipment, guests whose requirements I couldn't entirely predict, days when I had to produce something good from what was available rather than what I'd planned for. Those constraints were where the craft showed. Any competent cook can do well with a full pantry and a cooperative kitchen. The question that interested me was what you could do when you didn't have those things. I had been at Hadreth 7 for a little over 2 years when the Vorak first came through. I knew them by reputation before I knew them in person. The Vorak Compact was one of the 4 parties to the transit agreements that kept Hadreth 7 operational, which meant they were entitled to docking rights, resupply access, and the use of common facilities on a scheduled rotation. What the rotation documents did not convey, and what I learned through the more reliable channel of listening to people who had encountered them before, was that the Vorak had opinions. Specific, elaborate, cheerfully expressed opinions about the standards of every facility they used, every species they interacted with, and every practice they considered beneath their own. They were meticulous about this. They kept records. An assessor from the Compact's facility review office had once written. This came to me via Barentov, who had sources I never fully mapped. A formal complaint about the temperature calibration of a way station's water recyclers. That ran to 40 pages. The complaint had been accurate as it turned out. That was, I thought, worth knowing about them. They were crustacean in the broad way that the word applies to something alien. Not crabs, nothing so specific. But there was a family resemblance in the architecture. Articulated shell in overlapping plates across the back, and shoulders and outer arms. A natural armor that had done enough evolutionary work, over enough millennia, that the Vorak had largely stopped bothering with manufactured body protection. Their coloring ran in the red-brown range, deepening at the joints and lightening at the softer underbelly segments, where the plating thinned. They had 6 limbs, of which 4 served as arms in most configurations, and their facial structure centered on a set of rigid mouthparts that couldn't smile in the way a human face smiles, but that could, as I came to understand, convey a truly extraordinary range of dismissive amusement through subtle, positional changes that their own species read fluently and that I eventually learned to read approximately. Not perfectly. Approximately was enough. The first delegation was small, Overseer Threnk Ula and 4 subordinates, plus a logistics coordinator named Shes Korath, who spent most of her time in the cargo bay arguing about manifest discrepancies with our logistics officer Baron Tov, in a way that seemed to satisfy both of them deeply. Threnk Ula was the senior figure, which was legible without any briefing document. She moved like someone who expected spaces to adjust to her presence. And when she did not find them satisfying, she noted this in a tone that suggested the space ought to be embarrassed. She found the galley on her second day aboard. I heard her before I saw her, which was typical. The Vorak's natural shell produced a distinctive contact rhythm against the station's deck plating, not quite a click, and not quite a tap, but somewhere between. That carried well in metal corridors. She came through the galley entrance with 2 of her subordinates, and stopped at a distance of roughly 4 meters, which I later learned was a default Vorak appraisal position. Far enough to take in the whole of a space, before committing to closer engagement. I was making soup at the time. In the specific sense, I had a 40-liter pot going with the stock I'd been building for 3 days, and I was adding the aromatics, onion, garlic. Several things I had cultivated in the station's small hydroponic section were not precisely onion and garlic but filled similar functional roles in a preparation. And the galley was, I will admit, fragrant. The particular fragrance of alliums in hot fat is one of the oldest smells in human cooking, and it carries in a way that most other preparation smells do not. This was not a problem from my perspective. This was, as I said, a feature. Threnk Ula's mouthparts moved in a configuration I didn't yet have a name for. She said something to her subordinates in compact standard, which I understood at about 60% comprehension at that point in my time at the station. I caught the relevant words. One was the Vorak term for decomposition. Another was a descriptor I later had translated for me as aggressive organic distress. The third was a comparative phrase that positioned what I was doing relative to the Vorak concept of food preparation in a way that essentially described cooking as something a lesser species might do because it lacked the technology or biological development to avoid it. I turned around and said good afternoon in compact standard, which I had been practicing. There was a pause. Threnk Ula's mouthparts moved again, this time in what I had already learned to identify as surprise at being addressed directly. You speak the compact language, she said, in Union Standard, apparently deciding this was more convenient. A little, I said. I'm still learning. The smell, she said. What is that? Soup stock, I said. I can close the vent if it's bothering you. She made a sound that I recognized as a negative. Not discomfort, interest of a particular kind. The kind that is assembling material. You are the food preparer, she said. Mess Chief Nawais, I said. Yes. She looked at the pot. She looked at the prep counter, where I had the afternoon's work laid out. Flour for bread, a section of protein cultured from the station stores, several more of my hydroponic approximations, a row of small ceramic bowls I used for mise en place, a worn wooden board I'd had since culinary training, and had carried through 7 postings. The board was visibly used in the way that good tools get used over decades. Smooth at the center from the grain of constant work, the corners slightly raised from thousands of cycles of wet and dry. She looked at it, the way she looked at everything. Cataloging. Your species requires the thermal alteration of food matter, she said. It was phrased as an observation, but the subordinate in her right peripheral position made a small clicking sound that I understood, was the Forak equivalent of a poorly suppressed reaction to something entertaining. Some of it, I said. Not all. We eat raw food too. But you prefer it altered. We prefer it cooked, yes, I said. It's better that way. Better, she repeated. The word landed with a particular quality that I can only describe as the sound of someone saving a quote for later use. She said something to her subordinates again. I caught thermal alteration and primitive metabolic dependence, and a third phrase I didn't know yet. Later I looked it up. It translated roughly as evolutionary backslide. The subordinates' mouthparts moved in a synchronized configuration. That was the Vorak equivalent of shared amusement at a point well made. They left. The soup turned out very well. I gave the crew a larger portion than usual that evening, and didn't explain why, and nobody asked. That was the first visit. I should say something about the Vorak approach to food, because it is relevant, and because it explains a great deal about the subsequent visits. The Vorak consumed nutrient slabs, compressed blocks of processed organic matter, that delivered exactly what a Vorak physiology required with no excess, no variation, no temperature component, and no smell that a human nose would identify as food. They ate them in a utilitarian way that reminded me of taking medication, at intervals, in specific quantities, with no apparent pleasure and no apparent dissatisfaction. The slabs were produced by compact processing facilities and shipped in sealed containers that the Vorak delegation brought aboard in a quantity calculated to the precise day of their stay, plus a standard reserve margin. The Vorak did not eat in a social context the way humans do. They did not gather to share food. They did not consider the quality or composition of a meal a topic worth discussing, except in terms of processing efficiency. The idea that one might spend hours preparing food, or that the experience of eating it might be something other than mechanical refueling, was, from what I could gather, somewhere between incomprehensible and faintly pitiable to a Vorak sensibility. They had evolved past the need for it, or so they had concluded. The compact had educational materials about the nutritional systems of less developed species that I was told were quite instructive, in the way that materials written by people who consider themselves to have surpassed subject tend to be. This made Frank Ulla's sustained interest in my galley somewhat ironic, in the sense that she kept coming back to observe something she had already categorized as beneath her. But the Vorak are, among other things, thorough, and Frank Ulla had apparently decided that the galley represented a useful data point about human limitations, and she collected data points with the dedication of someone who believes that the universe is fundamentally a confirmation of things they already know. The second visit. 6 weeks later, she brought 3 subordinates, and what I can only describe as a prepared position. She had learned, in the intervening weeks, more Union Standard, and she deployed it with the precision of someone who had been given a new tool and intended to demonstrate its range. She arrived at the galley mid-morning, when I was doing bread, which is one of the more fragrant operations I run. The yeast working in the warm kitchen, the dough through its first rise in covered bowls. Along the counter the particular close smell of flour and fermentation that does not suggest anything other than bread to anyone who grew up around bread. She stood in the entrance for a moment, with the expression of someone who has arrived at a demonstration they had been told to expect. The thermal alteration process, she said. You perform it every day. Most days, I said. The crew requires it. The crew likes it, I said. There's a difference. She appeared to consider this. Your species experiences pleasure from the consumption of food. Yes. The preparation also produces pleasure? For some of us, I said. I've been doing this for 22 years, so I find it satisfying, yes. One of her subordinates, a younger Vorak, whose shell was still the brighter red of not quite maturity, made the clicking sound again. Frank Ulla did not make it, which I had begun to understand was a distinction. She reserved her amusement for delivery, in words rather than sound, because words were more precise and therefore more pointed. 22 years, she said. You have spent 22 years altering the temperature of food matter. Among other things, I said, and you consider this an occupation of value. I consider it an occupation of significant value. Yes, I said. People need to eat. They generally prefer to eat well. I help with that. Vorak do not require assistance with nutrient intake, she said. I know, I said. That must simplify things considerably. There was a pause. She looked at the bread, which was in its final proof, and would go into the oven in about 20 minutes. The station's oven was not sophisticated, but it was reliable, and I had learned its particular moods over 2 years, until I could produce bread from it, that I was genuinely proud of. The crust color it made, when you let it run 7 minutes past the point most people would call done, the way the bottom of a tin loaf needed to be turned out for the last 5 minutes, or you lost the quality on the underside. Small knowledge, accumulated over time. That was most of what I knew. What is that, she said. Bread, I said. Leavened wheat product. I bake it every other day. The smell, she said. Which was not precisely a complaint, but was not precisely not one. It gets stronger when it comes out of the oven, I said. I usually have a loaf ready around midday if you'd like to try a piece. The younger subordinate made a sound that was, I was fairly confident, genuine amusement rather than the suppressed kind. Frank Ulla looked at the oven, at the covered proofing bowl, at my hands, at the flour dusted across the board. Her mouthparts moved in the way I had come to read as deliberate composure, the Vorak equivalent of maintaining a neutral expression in the face of something you have decided to find instructive, rather than interesting, a species that devotes this degree of effort to altering the form of its nutrient intake, she said, in the tone of a person making a formal note, must derive a disproportionate percentage of its daily productivity toward that function. Probably about the right proportion, I said. She looked at me directly. You are not concerned by this inefficiency. I'm not especially concerned, no, I said. The bread will be ready in a couple of hours. I'll leave a loaf in the corridor junction if you change your mind. She left. I did leave a loaf at the corridor junction. It was gone the next morning, which told me nothing definitive, but which I found quietly interesting. On the third day of that second visit, Threnk Ulla brought 2 different subordinates. More senior figures, I gathered, from the depth of their shell coloring, and the way the others positioned themselves relative to them. She brought them through the galley entrance in the late morning. As I was doing stock work, and she spoke about the galley to them in compact standard with the fluency of a guide walking known terrain, I caught more of it than I had in the first visit. She described the equipment as functionally adequate for its purpose, while remaining structurally primitive. She described the hydroponic annex, visible through the inner window, as a compensatory agricultural measure consistent with species whose supply chains cannot be reliably maintained in remote postings. She described the smell, which that day was a stock reduction doing its quiet work, on the back burner, deep and slowly concentrating, as an occupational hazard of proximity to human facilities. One of the senior subordinates asked her something. She responded with a phrase that I understood moment after moment, as one adapts. The smell diminishes with exposure. I said, in compact standard, the stock will be finished by tomorrow. The smell is better when it's done. All 4 of them looked at me. Threnk Ulla's mouthparts shifted in the configuration I had come to read as the recalibration of an expectation, not surprise exactly. More the expression of someone who has been surprised in the same way twice, and is updating their model accordingly. The senior subordinates looked at each other. One of them said something to Threnk Ulla. She responded briefly. They left. I had the stock ready by the next morning, as I'd said. It was one of the better stocks I'd made at Hadreth 7. Clear, deep, with the particular quality that a long reduced stock achieves that no shortcut preparation quite replicates. I used it in the evening soup and the crew noticed. Barentov had seconds, our comms specialist, who was generally not a person who commented on food. One way or the other, said it was good. I filed that away the way I filed everything about what worked. That was the second visit. The third visit was 8 weeks after the second, and by this point, Threnk Ulla had either made the galley a formal stop on her Hadreth 7 itinerary, or she had simply lost the ability to resist it. She arrived each time in the late morning, when I was doing the most active prep work of my day, and she brought subordinates, whose composition varied, but whose attention, once she started speakings, was consistently focused in my direction. By the third visit, she had refined her commentary to a degree that suggested she had been thinking about it between visits. She described the galley as a relic of biological dependency. She described cooking as a compensatory behavior developed by species whose metabolic systems failed to evolve adequate processing efficiency. She described the smell of the day's prep. I was working on a braise, low and slow, the kind of thing that fills a space with something deep and complex that builds across a full morning and into the afternoon, as biologically aggressive and inconsistent with functional utility standards. She said all of this in a tone that was not unkind. Exactly. It was the tone of someone providing an honest assessment of a suboptimal condition to an entity that could not be expected to fully understand the assessment, patient, thorough, certain. She had arrived with 4 subordinates that day, including the bright-shelled young one from the visit, and the 2 senior figures who had also been there. She clearly considered the galley a reliable instructional resource. The subordinates watched me work while Threnk Uffa spoke. There was a quality to the watching that I have come to associate with intelligent creatures who are seeing something done competently that they have been told is not complicated. The slight adjustment of attention, the small pause in commentary. I did not address it directly. I kept my knife moving at the pace the work required, which was steady and not showy, and I checked the braise, and adjusted the flame, and tasted the reduction off a clean spoon, and made a note in my prep book. One of them said something to Threnk Ulla that I didn't catch, and she responded with a phrase I later looked up. It translated as, I bring them so they understand the full range of what they are working with. I was apparently illustrative. This was fine. The braise was a shoulder cut from the station's cultured protein stock, with a wine reduction and root vegetables from the hydroponic bay, and a handful of dried herbs. I had been keeping in a small tin since my previous posting. The smell was, I will say without apology, significant. It had been going since a 600, and by midday it had achieved that particular density that a long braise reaches. The point where the collagen in the meat has begun to release. The liquid has reduced to something with a coating quality, and the herbs have opened fully into the base. I checked it every hour. I knew what I was making. I told them this, not in those words. But when Threnk Ulla paused her commentary and looked at the pot with the attention of someone determining whether a phenomenon merits a new category, I said, it'll be done at about 1700. Best thing I've made this week. Her mouthparts moved through the fully visible configuration I had, by then identified as something between amusement and not quite admiration, but the precursor to it, the moment before certainty becomes something more complicated. You believe this to be of quality, she said. I know it to be of quality, I said. She made no further comment on that specific point. She left before the braise was finished. I plated it for the station's dinner service, and it was, if I am permitted to say so, one of the better meals I produced that year. Barentov ate slowly, which was how he ate things he was paying attention to. Our second medic asked if there was a second portion available. There was. That was the third visit. I thought about Threnk Ulla occasionally in the 3 months between the third and fourth visits. Not obsessively. I had a station to feed, and a hydroponic annex that required daily attention, and a crew of 11 whose dietary preferences I had long since memorized down to the level of who needed extra salt And who would eat anything if you put enough garlic in it? But she came to mind at odd moments. When I was working on something that was going particularly well, when I was tasting a reduction and finding it exactly where I'd aimed it, when I stood back from the prep counter and looked at what I'd assembled and knew, with the certainty that comes from long practice, that the meal was going to be good, I thought about the word relic. I thought about the word compensatory. I thought about the phrase that translated as evolutionary backslide, and I found that I was not bothered by it in any active way. Irritated would be too strong, and offended would be entirely wrong. But that it sat in my mind the way any interesting problem sits in the mind of someone whose profession is the practical application of a craft that the problem has dismissed. I was not trying to prove anything to Threnkula. I did not need her to revise her opinion of human cooking. But I was, over those 3 months, thinking about what I would cook if the situation ever presented itself, the way a craftsperson thinks about an unfamiliar material before they have occasion to work with it. I kept the tin of herbs. I maintained the hydroponic annex at its best possible yield. I expanded my mineral supplement inventory on the next resupply order, which Barentov noticed and asked about, and I told him I was experimenting with stock profiles, which was true as far as it went. I reviewed what I knew about non-human digestive systems, and what I didn't know, and I read what was available in the station's modest technical library on the subject, which was not extensive, but was something. I was not preparing for anything specific. I was simply cooking, and thinking, and keeping the galley ready. The 4th visit came 3 months after the 3rd. And I knew something was different. Before Threnkula came anywhere near the galley, I knew it because of Shes Korath. Shes Korath, the logistics coordinator, had been a consistent and reliable presence across all 3 previous visits. She and Barentov had developed a working relationship that operated almost entirely through manifest disputes, and I had the impression that both of them looked forward to it in the way that people look forward to a familiar argument that sharpens them up. She arrived at the cargo bay on a Tuesday. Barentov met her there, and within 40 minutes I could hear them from the galley, which was normal. What was not normal was that Sheskarath came to the galley an hour later. She had not done this before. She stood at the entrance in the way the Vorak stood when they were appraising a space, that 4-meter assessment distance, and she looked at what I was doing, which was routine afternoon prep, bread for the next morning, a stock reduction, some work on the hydroponic annex's latest yield, which had been good that week. She said nothing for a moment. Mess Chief Nways, she said. Shes Korath, I said. Good to see you. Coffee? She did not respond to the coffee offer. Your galley, she said. It is operational. It is, I said. Your stores. The current status. Reasonable, I said. We had a resupply 4 weeks ago. I'm well stocked for the next 2 months. She processed this in the particular Vorech way that involved a brief stillness, like something very fast pausing between movements. The station's hydroponic capacity, she said. You maintain it yourself? I do, I said. It supplements the stores, cuts the reconstituted product ratio down considerably. Another stillness. You produce food from primary biological cultivation aboard this station. A fair amount of it, yes. She made a note, not a metaphorical one. She had a device she made notes on and she made one. Then she left. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the afternoon. The questions had been logistical in shape, and Sheskorath thought in logistical shapes by profession. But they had not been the questions of someone interested in the station's performance metrics. They had been the questions of someone trying to understand a resource. Threnkula did not come to the galley on day 1. She was there, at the administrative end of the station, in the mornings, in the docking bay in the afternoons, moving through the station's functions. With her usual purposeful efficiency, her subordinates were quieter than I remembered them being on previous visits. The clicking sounds were absent. The delegation ate their nutrient slabs in the small common area they typically used. In the utilitarian way they always ate, but something in the choreography was different. Less settled, somehow. Though I could not have articulated precisely what I was reading, I was not yet certain what was happening. I had a hypothesis. Barentov confirmed it for me, obliquely, on the evening of day 2. He came into the galley after dinner service, when I was doing the last of the cleanup, and he leaned against the counter in the way he did, when he had information he was not sure what to do with. "Manifest issue," he said. "On the Vorak side." He looked at me. "You already knew." "I had an idea," I said. "What kind of manifest issue?" "Their nutrient supply," he said. "About a third of it is compromised. Processing error at the origin facility. Something in the binding compound that degrades when it hits the temperature differential in deep transit. Sheskoroth flagged it when they were doing the inventory this afternoon." He paused. "She didn't say it was bad. She said it was irregular." "A third," I said, "of the primary stock. The reserve margin covers some of the gap, but they're 8 days out from the next resupply point. And what they have left, the uncompromised portion, runs to about 4 days at normal intake rates." I thought about this. "They have 4 days of food," I said, "and 8 days before they can get more." "Approximately," he said. I nodded. I got the leftover bread from the evening service out of the storage wrap and put it on the counter. "Have a piece," I said. He had a piece. We didn't discuss the Vorak again that evening. I want to be precise about what I thought the next morning, because I have told this story a few times over the years, and there is a version of it that makes me sound more strategic than I was. I was not thinking about the 3 visits and the commentary on metabolic dependency and the evolutionary backslide. I was not thinking about what it would mean to serve Threnk Ulla, something she had described as biologically aggressive. I was not composing a lesson in my head, or calculating a point to make, or anticipating anything beyond the next 48 hours with any particular satisfaction. I was thinking that there were 7 Vorak aboard my station who were going to be hungry before they docked anywhere that could feed them, and that I had a well-stocked galley and 22 years of experience, and that feeding people, including people who were not human and who had been cheerfully specific about their low opinion of human food, was what I did. That was the whole of it. I got up early and I thought about what I knew about Vorak physiology. I did not know much. My experience with non-human dietary requirements was limited to the sulfur supplements from my time on the survey vessel and a passing familiarity with Chelhari protein ratios. What I knew about Vorak nutritional needs could have been written on one side of an index card and still left room for a shopping list. Their physiologies processed certain compounds efficiently and others poorly. They required a higher mineral density in their food intake than humans did, and their mouthpart structure made very fibrous materials difficult. That was approximately the full content of my index card. I went to the medic on morning rounds. Her name was Okafor Yemi, and she was the kind of medic who had been at remote postings long enough to develop strong opinions about everything and the patience to express them only when it mattered. "Vorak nutritional requirements," I said. She looked at me over her coffee. "For what purpose?" "I'm going to try to feed them," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she pulled up a file on her terminal and talked me through it for 20 minutes, including a specific breakdown of the mineral density requirements, notes on the 2 compound families I needed to avoid, and a reminder that Vorak physiology ran cooler than human physiology in a way that meant they might respond differently to served temperature that I was used to calibrating. She gave me a printed copy, which I folded into my apron pocket. "Have you told Threnk Ulla you're doing this?" she asked. "No," I said. She nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "If you ask first, she'll say no." I went back to the galley and looked at my stores and my hydroponic annex for a while. Then I started cooking. What I made on day 3 was not, to be entirely accurate, something I had made before. It was something adjacent to several things I had made before. A composed protein preparation, with a mineral-dense base stock, built from elements my stores could provide, seasoned with what I had that fell within the parameters of what Okafuryemi's notes described as acceptable, and finished in a way that I thought might approximate some of the textural characteristics while offering considerably more. In the way of what most living creatures respond to when food is well made. I tasted it every 30 minutes. I adjusted. I thought about it the way I thought about unfamiliar preparations. From the outside in, starting with what I knew the requirements were, and working toward what I knew how to make. Finding the place where they overlapped. By midday I had something I was willing to serve. The Vorak delegation ate together in the small common area at 1400 station time. This was known and consistent across all 4 visits. Whatever else the Vorak varied in their routines, the 1400 nutrition interval was fixed. I watched the corridor from the galley entrance until I saw the last of the subordinates go in, and then I put the food onto a service cart and pushed it down the corridor. I knocked on the frame of the common area entrance, because the Vorak room had no door, only a frame, and knocking on the frame was the closest available equivalent. Frank Ula was at the far end of the room. The delegation was arranged in their nutritional postures, a specific configuration of limbs that the Vorak adopted for eating that had the quality of something formal, a posture that had purpose, not ceremony. The nutrient slabs were on the central surface, the ones that remained. She looked at me. I pushed the cart in and set the prepared dish on the surface beside the nutrient slabs, without saying anything. I set down 7 plates, which was the full delegation count, and a set of the simple utensils I kept for non-human guests. Then I stepped back. Frank Ulla looked at the dish for a moment. She looked at the plates. She looked at me. "This is human food," she said. "It's food," I said. A pause. "We have not requested food." "I know," I said. Another pause. "The station has no obligation to provide compact crew with human rations." "No," I said. "There's no obligation. I just made some extra." She looked at the dish again. Her mouth parts moved very slightly. The subordinates were still. The young one, not the same young one from the first visit, a different one, with a slightly brighter shell coloring, looked at Threnkola, and then at the dish, and then back at Threnkola. "You are aware," she said, "that we have expressed specific views regarding human nutritional methods." "You have, yes," I said. "On more than one occasion." 3 occasions, I said. "Approximately." The silence that followed was a particular quality of silence that I have learned to recognize over the years. It is the silence of someone who has been handed an unexpected variable and is determining how to incorporate it. "The dietary composition," she said, "has this been prepared with awareness of compact biological requirements?" "I spoke with our medic this morning," I said. "There are no compounds in it that fall outside acceptable parameters. For Vorak physiology, the mineral density is higher than standard human preparation. I used the deep-water kelp supplement from our stores to bring it up. The fiber content is moderate. I'd call it a reasonable first effort." She looked at me. Something in her expression, or in the configuration of her mouth parts, which functioned as an expression, shifted in a way I couldn't precisely name. "A first effort," she said. "For this particular application," I said. "I've been cooking for 22 years, but not specifically for Vorak. So yes, first effort." The subordinate with the bright shell made a very small movement that I had come to interpret as involuntary amusement, held in check by formality. Frank Ulla said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at the dish, and she reached out with one of her forward limbs, and she took a small amount onto one of the plates, and she tasted it. I waited. I was very good at waiting. 22 years of service teaches you that the moment between the first taste and the response is not a moment you improve by rushing. Her mouth parts moved through several configurations in rapid sequence. This was, I had come to understand, the Vorak equivalent of processing. Not mastication in the human sense, but a sequential engagement that served a similar function, and that conveyed, to someone who could read the configurations, something of what the substance was doing. She was silent throughout it. Then she set the plate down. She said something in compact standard to her delegation. I understood perhaps 40% of it directly, but I caught the phrase, acceptable parameters. And something that I think was a construction meaning, proceed at individual discretion. The subordinates looked at each other. The bright-shelled one looked at the dish, then at the plate nearest to them, then, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they are committing to, served themselves. I left the cart and went back to the galley. Day 4. I adjusted the recipe overnight. The mineral balance had been within parameters, but I thought I could do better. The texture had been slightly dense, and I had an approach in mind, involving a different hydration ratio that would open it up. The temperature I'd served at had been calibrated to human preferences, and I brought it down several degrees, based on what Okafor Yemi had told me about Vorak thermal biology. Small adjustments, the kind that only matter if you're paying attention to what you're adjusting toward. I also made bread. Day 4 was a bread day on my regular schedule, and I was not going to skip it because of guests. I had said on the third visit that there would be bread in the corridor junction. I had said the same on the second visit. The loaf had disappeared. I did not pretend not to know what this meant. I made the bread. I brought the cart at 1400 again, with the adjusted preparation, and a loaf wrapped in cloth beside it. Threnk Ulla was at the entrance this time. Instead of the far end of the room, she looked at the cart. She looked at the cloth-wrapped loaf. The leavened wheat product, she said. Yes, I said. A pause from the third visit. Yes, I said. Her mouthparts moved through the brief configuration I had initially read as dismissal, and later revised to something more like recognition. You said it would be available in the corridor, she said. I did, I said. You never came by. Another pause. The delegation will consider it, she said. Of course, I said. I set the cart down and left them to it. The bread was gone when I collected the cart at 1600. The main preparation was gone. There was nothing on any of the 7 plates that suggested anything had been left uneaten. The cloth I'd wrapped the bread in was folded, which was not something I had expected, but which, when I unfolded it in the galley, I found had been done in a particular way, the edges aligned precisely, the corners squared. Sheskorth's work, I suspected. The logistics coordinator's instinct extended, apparently, to borrowed linen. I made a note to myself about the bread. Good to know what they could work with. Day 5. I made the grain preparation I'd been thinking about since the previous afternoon. A long-cooked, based at the stations, stores could provide easily, and that, given what I now understood of Vorak processing requirements, would likely work well. I added a mineral supplement to the cooking liquid that brought the density up above what I'd managed on day 3. It was not a complex dish. It was the kind of preparation that gains its quality from time and attention rather than technique, the kind of thing that experienced cooks produce without thinking, but that tastes like more than it cost. I have made variations of that dish at every posting I've ever held. You learn the core and you adapt it to what you have, and after 22 years, the adaptations come automatically. That morning, I was adapting it to a new guest, whose requirements I was beginning to understand, and the dish came out well, and the understanding was what made it come out well. I tasted it before I brought it down, tasted it the way I tasted everything I made, not checking for problems, but paying attention to what was actually there. The mineral profile was better than day 3. The texture was what I'd aimed for. The temperature was right for the physiology I was serving. I stood at the prep counter for a moment and thought, yes, this is good. Then I put it on the cart. The cart was empty at 1600. Day 6 I got braver with the seasoning. I had been conservative on days 3 and 4. The right choice for any new guest, until you know what you reworking with. But I had information now, built day by day, the way information about a guest always builds if you are paying attention. I used the fuller range of what I had available. In the way that cooking actually works when you trust the pantry, and trust your hands, and stop treating the preparation as a medical protocol rather than a meal. There is a difference, even in food made under constraint, between food that is safe and food that is good. I was aiming for both. Any cook who is only aiming for one of those things is not doing the full job. The cart came back with every plate scraped clean, and the serving vessel clean to a degree that suggested instruments. Day 7. The braise. Not precisely the braise from the third visit, because I was not the same cook I had been on the third visit, in the sense that I now had 4 days of specific information about this specific audience, but the same fundamental logic. Long, low patient, a shoulder cut from stores, a reduction built on the mineral-dense stock I'd developed across the week. Root vegetables from the hydroponic annex, the herbs from my tin deployed with more confidence than I'd used on any previous day. I had it going by 0600, by 1000 the quality of corridors, where something good has been happening for a long time. By noon the smell had reached that particular density a braise achieves at its proper point. The moment where everything in the pot has had the time it needed and is simply ready. Ulla appeared at the galley entrance at 12:30. She had not done this before. Come at midday, before the cart run. She stood at the 4-meter position, and looked at the pot on the back burner and looked at me, and her mouthparts were still in the way I had come to read as attention, rather than appraisal. She was not cataloging. She was paying attention. There is a difference. And I had come to recognize it across the 4 visits. The way you recognize any shift in how someone carries themselves when the terms of an encounter have quietly changed. This is the preparation from the 3rd visit, she said. Similar, I said. Adjusted. You have been preparing it since morning. Since 0600, I said. It needs the time. The 3rd visit version needed more time than I gave it. This one is right. She was quiet for a moment. She did not move from the entrance. She was not, I noted, moving toward the exit either. She was standing at the entrance of the galley she had described, on her first visit to it, as a relic of biological dependency, and she was smelling what a braise smells like at its 7th hour. And she was standing there. The crew of this station, she said, they receive this quality of preparation regularly. This quality, yes, I said, not always this specific dish, but this standard. Another pause. Her mouthparts moved through a sequence I hadn't seen before. Not the amusement configurations of the early visits, not the disciplined composure of days 3 and 4. Something that required a longer look to read, and that I filed for later interpretation. You have been doing this for 22 years, she said. It was not a question. It was the repetition of a fact that someone was placing in a new context. Yes, I said. She left without further comment. I brought the cart at 1400. The braise was everything I'd thought it would be. At 1700, 2 hours after I'd collected the empty cart and washed everything and started the evening service, the young subordinate with the bright shell came to the galley entrance. I had not had a subordinate come to the galley entrance before, only Ulla herself, or Shes Korath on that one occasion. The young subordinate stood at the 4-meter position, and looked at the galley, looked at me. Yes, I said. There was a pause, then, in careful Union Standard, that had the quality of something learned recently and deployed with deliberate accuracy. Overseer Ulla requests to know if there is additional preparation available. I looked at the young subordinate. How many additional portions? I said. A pause and a consultation with a small communication device 3. I looked at the pots. I had made somewhat more than the delegations, 7 portions. On the basis that a dish worth making is worth making fully, and that running short is a worse problem than having excess. That was how I had always cooked. It had nothing to do with the circumstances. Yes, I said. Come back in 10 minutes. The young subordinate came in 10 minutes and took 3 covered plates down the corridor. I found out from Baron Fove the next morning that Frank Ulla had requested one of the 3 additional portions for herself. I said nothing to Barentov about this. He did not press me. He had a piece of the morning's bread, the good loaf, not the end of yesterday's, and went back to his manifests. Day 8 was the last day of the visit. I made something simple for day 8, not because I was out of ideas. I made something simple because the right ending to a week of increasingly complex preparation is often something clean and direct. Something that demonstrates the skill is in the cook, and not in the elaborateness of the dish. A good cook can make simple things well. A week that ended with the most straightforward preparation. Being obviously excellent said more than another complex one would have. It was a stock-based preparation with the hydroponic annex's best current yield, and a grain component, and a very simple seasoning arrangement that I had been working on mentally since day 5. Not impressive on the surface, the kind of thing a less experienced cook might have made on day 1 and produced something merely adequate. But it was extremely well made, which is not the same thing, and it was the product of 8 days of paying attention. I brought the cart at 1400. Frank Ulla was at the far end of the room, where she had been on day 3, the first time. Her delegation was in their nutritional postures. The uncompromised portion of their nutrient slab supply was on the surface beside the plates untouched. I did not know when it had been last used. I did not ask. I set down the cart. I set out the plates. I stepped back. Frank Ulla looked at the cart for a long moment. Then she said, in compact standard, something I understood fully. I had, over the course of 8 days, picked up the gaps in my comprehension. Through the intensive process of being in the same room with Vorak speakers, and paying close attention, she said, inform the mess chief that this will be acknowledged in the visit record. She did not say it to me directly. She said it to Sheskorath, who was across the room. I was at the cart, right there, within easy speaking distance. She could have said it to me. She chose not to, and I understood why she chose not to, and I did not make it difficult for her. I collected my empty cart at 1600, folded the cloth, that had been folded again by Sheskorath, with the same precisely squared corners as every previous day, and went back to the galley. The delegation departed at 0800 the following morning. Frank Ulla came through the corridor junction at 0730, which took her past the galley entrance. The morning bread was already in the oven, the station's familiar smell, the one that had been there every other morning for 2 years. The smell that had been the first thing she had commented on, and the last thing she was going to leave behind. I heard her footsteps, that particular contact rhythm on the deck plating, familiar by now as any sound in the station, the same rhythm I had first heard on the second day of the first visit, and had been hearing at intervals ever since. Slow slightly at the entrance, not stop, slow. The difference between passing and pausing, which is its own kind of acknowledgement. I looked up from the prep counter. She looked at the oven. She looked at the prep work I had laid out for the day's service. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything. She continued down the corridor. That was the 4th visit. The formal amendment arrived 6 weeks later, transmitted through the standard compact administrative channel that handled treaty way station protocols. It was a document of 17 pages, which is not unusual for compact administrative instruments. The Vorak have an institutional approach to paperwork that makes them excellent treaty partners and exhausting house guests. The amendment addressed resupply protocols, manifest verification procedures, common facility maintenance standards, and several other matters I did not read closely. Paragraph 11 addressed what it termed supplementary nutritional provision. It specified, in the formal language of compact treaty documents, that treaty way station Hadrith 7 was requested to maintain a standing reserve of human-prepared food stores, sufficient to provide full nutritional coverage for a Vorak delegation of standard complement for a period of not less than 10 days. The provision was classified under the treaty's Mutual Aid Clause, which was the clause that covered emergency shared resource access. The justification field, which in compact administrative documents runs to several paragraphs in most cases, contained a single sentence. The sentence noted that the Waysay Station's food preparation capacity had proven adequate to the standard of compact dietary requirements. Proven adequate. That was the phrase. Not acceptable. Not the word Threnk Ulla had used on day 3, the word she had offered as if granting a concession at some cost. Adequate. A term that in compact legal and administrative usage carries a specific weight. It means something that meets the required standard. It means something that functions. It is not praise. It is not admiration. It is the compact's version of, this is a thing that is what it says it is. I read the amendment in the morning, before the breakfast service. Barentov had forwarded it to me with a note that said only, paragraph 11 and nothing else. I read paragraph 11 twice. Then I put the document face down on the counter and went back to what I'd been doing, which was shaping the morning's bread. It was a cool day on the station. The thermal cycling had been running slightly off balance that week, and the corridor temperatures had dropped by a couple of degrees. Nothing serious. The kind of ambient variation you lived with at a remote posting. Good bread weather, as it happened. Low humidity, slightly cool air. The dough developing in a way I preferred. The station had its seasons, the way all small enclosed spaces have seasons. Not weather exactly, but rhythms of warmth and cool, of activity and quiet, of full galleys and lean ones. I had learned them over 2 years, the way you learn the moods of any kitchen you work in for. Long enough. Adequate. 22 years, 7 postings. 400 and some days at Hadrith 7. Every meal I'd made for 11 people, and an uneven rotation of guests, whose idea of food ranged from things I recognized to things I had learned to fake and things I had invented for the occasion. The Chelhari sulfur supplements. The time on my 3rd posting, when a Dravan delegation had arrived with dietary requirements so specific that I had spent 2 days doing nothing but research and recipe tests before I was confident enough to serve them, and they had eaten well, and one of them had come back to the galley afterward and told me in their own language that the meal had been appropriate, which was the highest compliment Dravan formal usage permitted. I had accepted it with the seriousness it was offered with. Now I had a 17-page compact administrative amendment with a single-sentence justification field. The Vorak were, as I had understood from the beginning, very thorough. They kept records, they filed correct documents. When something met the required standard, they said so. In writing with the appropriate classification, under the appropriate clause, transmitted through the appropriate channel, and they did not add more than the situation required. Threnkulla had told me, 3 visits ago, that the compact had evolved past the need for the kind of work I did. The amendment did not say she had been wrong. It said that what I did met the compact dietary standard, and should be maintained in reserve accordingly. She had not been wrong. Exactly. She had been working from incomplete information. The most any of us can do, working from incomplete information, is eventually update the record. Adequate was fine with me. The bread went in the oven. The station woke up around me the way it always did. Barentov arguing with a manifest, somewhere down the corridor. One of the medics running morning vitals in the bay. The engineering team doing their first shift walkthrough of the systems that kept us all breathing. Ordinary sounds. Hadreth 7 sounds. I put the kettle on and thought about what I'd make for lunch.